Hello and welcome to this Gartner webinar. I'm Kashif, your moderator for this session. And before we get started, I have a few tips to help enhance your webinar experience. Around the video player, you'll find a variety of ways to interact with this session. We encourage you to participate by clicking the Ask the Speaker box to submit your questions and thoughts throughout this program. You can either submit a question anonymously, or if you choose, your name, title, and company can be visible along with your questions. To download a copy of the presentation slides and other helpful resources, just navigate to the bottom of the page. Throughout the program, you can rate this session and share feedback on the insights provided. To submit your ratings, click Rate Session below the player. A box will open for you to select 1 to 5 hearts. Please note that 5 hearts is the top ratings. Share your feedback on the insights provided in the Leave Further feedback box and click Send. This webinar is being recorded. You can watch this presentation again and find more great insights on demand at gartner.com/webinars. Now, I'd like to welcome Gartner Senior Director Analyst Remy Gulzar and Gartner VP Analyst Joanne Kopcho. Remy and Joanne, thanks for joining us. And now, Joanne, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kashif, and welcome everyone. And thank you for joining my colleague Remy and I today. Governance has been a very popular topic among many of our client discussions, and Remy and I have been having a lot of discussions this year around governance overall. Our businesses and services continue to face an increasing number of challenges, disruptions, and innovations that impact and change our priorities, thus impacting our need to make decisions quicker so that we can deliver at the speed that our businesses are going. Well, governance helps us do that. And in 2021, Gartner conducted a survey. There we go. In 2021, Gartner conducted a survey on reinventing governance for the digital era, and we found that more than half of the participating CIOs and technology executives state that their IT governance has become more collaborative. Well, that's good, because as organizations transform, many of the old assumptions about how we run our business are really no longer valid. True transformation in an organization means that we're changing many components of our business model, whether it's the customer, financials, business capabilities, or the value proposition. Therefore, as executive leaders and CIOs, we need to confront this new reality squarely on. This means acknowledging that the environment now dictates what is possible for the business and how quickly it needs to move. Adaptive leaders really don't guess or follow hunches about the future. Instead, they gather as much information as they can, and this data becomes critical for overcoming preconceptions so that leaders can now identify new business conditions. So in other words, as CIOs and executive leaders, we must efficiently and effectively navigate continual change with more collaborative decision-making practices. Well, go ahead, Remy, please.
Yeah, and I would want to add here as well, because I think Joanne raises a great point, and because being more collaborative as well actually means that governance is not anymore managed from the center, which brings to Joanne's point around, to get good governance going, we actually need more coordination than ever to make the right decisions across the enterprise.
Absolutely, Remy. And so we need to start with some basics around governance in order to get to that decision, making the right decisions at the right time for the right outcomes. And for some reason, my slides are not advancing. There we go. So let's start with the basics about governance. Governance is really about decisions. And I tend to say governance is all about decision making whenever I talk to any of our Gartner clients. And across the governance spectrum, we might be making a lot of different decisions that look at different decision makers and different decision styles and directions that come out within our organization. But when we talk about governance, deciding who decides what, decides when, we really need to make sure that we balance these decision rights and the decision makers along with the risk, the compliance, and the investment to further understand how are we going to support the business? How are we going to meet our goals within our organization? How can we leverage any partners we have within our organization or even across the ecosystem for mutual benefit? And what capabilities do I need in order to drive out these new objectives we're trying to reach? Whether that's leveraging technology trends for AI, machine learning, and the Internet of Things, and anything else that might be out there impacting our businesses today. Good decision making is connected by clearly defined governance mechanisms, such as the rules, the principles, the process, the roles, and the structure. This really helps us distinguish who decides what and when within our organizations.
Great point, Joanne. And I would like to add here as well is that the why for governance actually still applies, meaning that governance applied appropriately is a source of competitive advantage, right? Organizations that make better decisions faster ultimately win. And on the other hand, organizations showcasing weak governance practices underperform and are at risk from a regulatory perspective. So having good governance, to Joanne's point, is in everybody's benefit.
But making good decisions, Remy, is not always easy for many organizations to understand. In fact, even Remy and I, as analysts, struggle with decision-making practices within our research team. And we also found in that same survey that I mentioned earlier that much of the governance that is currently out there, the 43% of the CIOs and technology executives that took the survey ranked a lack of strategic alignment between the business and IT among their top 3 most challenging inhibitors to having effective governance in the organization. The real ask for us as leaders is how can we make governance less burdensome and still do its job at the speed of business for our organizations? Well,
Yeah,
this is what, oh, I'm sorry, Remy, go
yeah,
ahead.
I would say that's actually a great point you raised there because I think people might wonder how come there's a lack of strategic alignment and aren't we busy with governance as an alignment mechanism for over 2 decades? So how come we are still struggling with this? And I think Joanne raised a point around how our business is changing, and as we can see here, is that with the kind of rise of digitalization, digital transformation, disruptive technologies, things around the way that we use distributed and empowered teams has actually not strengthened the alignment. It has actually distributed the alignment, so it became less visible. And that's why now you see the kind of narrative happening across many organizations where they actually are rethinking: is everybody still doing the right things? Right? Are we still focused on achieving the right objectives, even if we do have 300 agile teams across our enterprise? Am I absolutely sure that they're working on the right things?
And that's a good point. And this is also a place where just enough governance can come into play within our organizations. There we go. Just enough governance is really a minimalist approach that really accelerates decision making within our organizations. It focuses on strategic engagement while maintaining risk. Now, governance, as I mentioned earlier, is really about decision making. And then there are some practices that feed into that decision making, which may be often what gets confused with governance around what we do in the management framework, as Gartner defines it. Management is really about doing the right things and the practices and the approaches to get to those. But occasionally we need to make decisions, whether we're going to turn right or turn left, whether we're going to focus on something that's net new or maintain the core. We often as organizations, we confuse those 2 approaches. And when we have clients come to us and talk about just enough governance, providing a minimalist approach, removing the bureaucracy from our governance decision-making practices, we often try to help separate out those management practices and those management framework activities from the decision-making and having just enough level of decision-making to build in a certain level of speed and agility within the organization. When we think about just enough governance, we want that approach to be very collaborative, adaptive, and drive continuous decision-making capabilities that helps our organizations really negotiate and resolve any of the constraints we had around decision-making early in the practice so that we can have frictionless planning and delivery of business outcomes going forward. Adopting this type of approach also entails changing the approach to decision making and minimizing the number of enforced checks and balances we may have within some of our decision making practices today. Therefore, just implementing just enough governance should only be considered in areas that seek agility and acceleration, as the culture will also need to change to balance the speed and quality of execution as decision making is accelerated within the enterprise.
Absolutely. And for those that are reading very carefully on the statement on screen, you might be looking, say, well, Joanne and Remy, what happened to alignment, right? And for us, alignment is actually an outcome of strategic engagement. And so for us, strategic engagement is the process on how you basically get executives and other key stakeholders part of the decision-making process rather than claiming on them to say, well, make this decision now, because the decision will never happen in the moment at that time. A decision needs to be prepared, needs to be vetted, needs to be ordained in a certain way that an executive can make that decision safely in terms of the exposure that it can cause to the organization. And that's why strategic engagement is actually the kind of lever that you would pull to make sure that executives feel empowered, but also recognize when they make that decision.
Absolutely. And so just enough governance isn't a loophole. It isn't a catch-all. It isn't a shortcut. It's not a one size fits all. You need to look across your organization to find where it's a best fit. And more importantly, it's not a shortcut to getting things done faster without having to go through a lot of decision-making processes, because you want to make sure your decisions are aligned to the objectives you're trying to achieve for the organization. So there's
Absolutely.
no fast-paced, simple answers to that comes with just enough governance. And we're
Yeah.
truly sorry for that.
Yeah. Well, in a way, we are a bit sorry because I think if you came to say, well, listen, we now have found the silver bullet that will solve all our governance problems, sadly, it's not the case. And it actually gets even worse because the thing is that to have just enough governance actually is built on a foundation of very strong governance. So we would never tell you if your governance is broken today, just move to a just enough governance model and the world gets better. Most likely not, right? So what we definitely advocate here is that those considering just enough governance can only do it on the back of a very mature governance practice.
And that requires you to do some thinking and adjust the approach to how you create those outcomes you need with the right level of oversight and risk mitigation that every company wants. So how do we get started? Well, these are the three must-haves that we're going to talk through today, and the three key issues that we want you to address to try to get into just enough governance. So let's start by understanding our current governance maturity. When we understand how mature our decision making is today, well, there's a variety of methods that any CIO or IT leader or executive leader can leverage. You can start by asking simple questions. And we outline 4 very simple questions here that we define as part of diagnosing and maturing your current governance. Are we doing the right things? Are we getting the expected benefits? Are we doing the right things the right way? And more importantly, are we delivering the outcomes optimally and well? When we look across these questions, we can begin looking into, well, how well is the decision making we're utilizing currently today helping us accomplish the goals and objectives we need? Decision making and decisions being made across the organization must link to the right things at the right time for the right outcomes. It's a very simple saying I use quite a bit when we talk to our clients about decision making. But more importantly, we also can look at a deeper dive into our governance maturity to see how well decisions are being made and how well the mechanisms of governance are being used by even leveraging some of the Gartner score for CIOs, for example. When you diagnose decision making, make sure it's focused on helping your organization's ability to achieve strategic and operational fit. and how that operational fit is helping to utilize the IT assets you're providing back into your organization.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just to reflect on some of the kind of questions we see, I think this approach is not necessarily tied to IT governance as well, right? These are the kind of foundational elements of good governance. I could apply this to my governance as well. Data governance doing the right things? Is my data governance creating the expected benefits? So see this more as a way of saying, how do I test for good governance? And when you look at the kind of decision points that you will come across, they're always tied to what is the scope and mandate across the enterprise, right? Is the scope of governance around making strategic decisions, investment decisions, decisions around setting risk appetite, but even maybe decisions around, which kind of decisions do we need to maybe embrace, I would say, less tightly because we want to innovate. We want to maybe, push the boundaries in certain ways. And so these inflection points on decisions are always linked to a certain outcome that the enterprise wants. And the negotiation and resolvement around what eventually the decision will be is often a kind of the enterprise versus the organizational unit that wants to achieve something that might go against some of these enterprise guardrails. And this is where the kind of decision making needs to happen to make sure that a risk adjusted approach is taken here.
And so when we think about understanding our governance maturity, we also need to think about how we can evolve some of that maturity, and maybe even to Remy's point, look across not just IT governance, but a wide variety of decision making that might be occurring, whether that's occurring within projects, within product teams, within different aspects of the organization, that they all need to come back together across the strategy and the strategic objectives you're trying to encompass. This is where we want to take that understanding of our current maturity and determine where there are opportunities to evolve more traditionalized command and control, one-size-fits-all based governance into some more adaptive governance decision styles. So as our organizations mature and become more complex, we move out of just a single one-size-fits-all control-based governance, which is still needed in a lot of our organizations. There are corporate compliance objectives, there are rules and regulations that our businesses run by, there are mandates that our public sector entities need to fulfill, whether they're legislative mandates or whether there's overarching compliance mandates that we need to look at. That control-based style, though, can't be the only style of decision making. And when we move beyond that into outcome-based decision, now we're beginning to build within our organization the mindset around how we're accomplishing and what we're doing and what it's providing back into the strategic objectives we're trying to accomplish as an organization. The other styles of adaptive governance that drive different types of decision making also take into account, as we move into agility-based decision styles, the roles in the teams and empowering those roles and teams to make decisions. You may be doing that within some of your product teams today, but those product teams typically have some level of boundary or set of principles or rules that are guiding the decisions they make. And when it goes beyond that boundary, it may need to come back into an outcome-based decision that's driven by a different decision maker, or even in some cases, a control-based decision. And we've typically seen agility-based decision styles even in our non-product, in our traditional project and program types directives. Just ask any project manager or program manager, they're given a boundary. And that boundary is typically cost, budget, and scope. And if it goes beyond that, and there might be criteria beyond that, then they have to escalate up to an executive sponsor, or to maybe even take the business case even broader to a broader committee that says, yeah, we're willing to invest more to achieve this outcome, or no, we're not willing to take that risk within it. So that agility-based style may already exist in pockets in your organization, but it also increases as your organization grows and matures its operating model and the complexity of how governance is used across the enterprise. And then finally, the last decision style, which is the most complex and most mature, is the autonomous decision style that really looks at how we leverage people and things to drive value and mitigate and manage risk within our organizations. Understanding these different decision styles can also help you create action plans to address improvements within your current state governance or your current maturity of governance that you have. It's an opportunity to address and evolve some of the decision making that's currently existing within your organization.
Absolutely. And as an additional point, if you look at the model that is right here, the model is progressive in a way, saying there are no steps that you can skip, right? So it's impossible for you to go to agility-based governance if you have no sense about what your control-based governance looks like in terms of, meeting compliance and protecting the enterprise license to operate, versus the portfolio you will construct of, strategic projects and outcomes that the agility teams must be working on. So that's what these two outer rings are highlighting, basically, is the complexity of decision making and the required maturity need. Linking back to what Joanne said in one of the earlier slides around, Gartner score for CIOs, this is where you can actually take a maturity assessment to see how far your current governance approaches are reaching, and where in certain pockets of your enterprise you could actually start to explore and pilot new ways of decision making. Because even though in the agile realm people think G is a bad word, right? The big G, bad governance. In the end, it's still all about decision making, right? And so if decision making is really the kind of capability that brings us forward, then I think good decision making is a responsibility for us all, in the agile teams, in the enterprise teams, in the product teams, platform teams, you name it. Connected decision making is the key capability of the future.
Absolutely. And we want to, as we progress our decision making and evolve some of the styles of our decision making, we also finally need to transform the way that we drive decisions. So we talked a little bit earlier on about not only assessing the maturity of our governance, but that maturity assessment may look at some of the mechanisms, whether it's the rules, the processes, the structure, the roles, or even the culture that drives a lot of the decision making within your organization. We want you to focus on progressing from rules to principles and eventually to the behaviors that you're trying to drive out within the decision making. You might be driving those behaviors out as you leverage different styles of decision making, as well as you mature maybe some of the gaps that you found in your current governance maturity. Most control-based organizations establish some set of rules in order to create order out of chaos. Well, that may work for a period of time, but it also creates a one-size-fits-all type of behavior. We know that this is not necessarily conducive to a fast-paced, ever-changing reality that our businesses live in today. So moving to the other end of the spectrum, when we open everything up and there are no boundaries or rules, well, that may be fast-paced and innovative, but there's a cost associated with that. And not every organization can absorb that risk or cost. So how do we manage this shift? And how do we introduce that level of just enough? Well, as we progress from rules to principles, we eventually will get the behaviors we want within our decision making. But it also starts with understanding, well, what do you mean by progressing from rules to principles? Well, what is a principle? Well, a principle, and I'm going to use the same word in the word definition of a principle, but I'm also going to give you an example here, so bear with me. A principle is a rule or guideline that provides a clear direction and expresses the values of the organization. It provides actionable guidance for real decision making. And it really can connect to the business success that are very specific to your enterprise or are transparent to everyone and are detailed enough to drive trade-offs. So let me give you an example of a principle, and it's not even IT or business related. I'm going to take the America's Yacht Club yacht race, America's Cup yacht race. And one of the captains of one of the boats had a principle for his team. When we're out on the water, whatever decision you make the boat go faster. That was a principle for them. So as the team were doing their jobs, whether it's leading or raising or lowering sails or moving the rudders or whatever they needed to do, they all had a decision point in their mind or a principle in their mind that basically says, whatever I'm going to do out there, I'm not going to wait and ask for the captain's permission. I'm not going to wait and talk to 3 people and get consensus on it. I'm going to make a decision that's going to make the boat go faster. That principle guided that team to work together to get to the end result, which is hopefully finishing the America's Cup yacht race in first place. Notice how that principle of making the boat go faster drove the direction of the team. The principles that we've outlined here is an example to show how a corporate rule or a corporate guideline or a corporate principle, as we've defined here, really drives and indicates some of the behaviors and some of the decision making that may occur within different decision styles across our organization, or may even drive out the principles that IT leverages to make decisions as they're looking at how their behaviors are socially and environmentally responsible. So taking that principle can really provide the guidance across the organization and drive decision making towards a direction for the organization, and still link together at various levels across the decision making within the organization. As we leverage these principles, we're also providing direction to teams, individuals, managers, and executives. It gives a lot of flexibility to get things done faster, but it also begins to put boundaries and drive behavioral changes within our organization. I talked about creating boundaries earlier when I was talking about the agility-based decision style. The similar thing can come from these principles that allow the flexibility for the teams and individuals and managers to get to that end state that you're trying to drive out, and begin to change some of the culture and the behaviors of the organization as you begin to mature your governance. So now I'm going to basically take this and hand over to my colleague Remy to talk about how do we build off of understanding our current maturity and move into a culture for joint accountability. Remy?
Thank you, Joanne. So I think what you heard Joanne talk about is, all the great, concepts and things that we have developed over time to help organizations make better decisions. And I think right now you're at the point probably where you're thinking, well, Gartner, great, all these concepts, but can you show me how it comes together in actual examples that we see, in different organizations? So going back to the model that Joanne showed, the adaptive governance model, here you see a particular implementation of that model through the governance mechanisms that many organizations use, right? Um, the rules and principles that you can leverage, the roles that you can have in the organization, the structures that you can have, and the processes. Often organizations tend to stop there. But in our opinion, and the way that we have now observed how governance evolves, and you could say, well, governance, the era of checks and balances, COVID with 30 plus processes, everything around making sure, that we hit the right box is ever since evolving, actually, because I think one of the strongest governance mechanisms that has now resurfaced over time is culture. And that's why this is one of the very few approaches that you see here today on screen, where actually culture has made a kind of underpinning role of every type of governance lever that you can think of. Because to us, culture is almost embedding everything that we do today. And so in the sense that if you make culture the center of your governance design, things will go much more fluid, as the culture will actually make sure that those kind of things that you design are culturally speaking appropriate, right? So for instance, if you look at the rules and principles, things like shared accountability, things that are around, is it ethical for us to do this? They cannot always be captured in a check mark, right? Or in a checkbox. Things around roles, how do you look at the roles? Do we really look roles to be inclusive of each other? Joanne's very first slide that talked about, governance becoming more collaborative. This is something that we see as part now as the new markup of people's job profiles, that being able to work better together becomes ever so more important than you being the deep subject matter expert on a very specific technology. What we also see is that our structures are getting adapted and changed to make sure actually that exchange of information can happen much quicker. We make sure that our product teams are of a certain size. We make sure that in our agile teams, we have a certain kind of representation of, what we feel is the right mix of skills, competencies, and behaviors. We even make sure that across the corporate structures we resolve tensions in a timely way, not making a way that the corporate team or the risk management team is always at the end of the journey to then basically pull the red flag and say, well, my dear agile team, this is not going to happen. If you have a culture of joint accountability, that IT risk team would have been joining you at the beginning of the process and not at the end of the delivery of the particular solution. And these are the kind of ways where actually we say that looking at governance nowadays, the culture aspect must be truly embedded through and throughout for you to actually make a scalable and sustainable way of governing when you are not in the room, right? And this is the key principle that Joanne was talking about, because in the end, if you're not in the room, a principal must tell people what is the best option to pick from two available options. And getting to more empowered organizations, more distributed teams, that are sitting further away from the old, corporate center, you must be able to trust on the kind of accountabilities that people have and that they will fulfill the kind of behavioral kind of requirements that they need to show in terms of making sure that the whole enterprise sails at speed in the right direction. Now, in a way to show you an example, so here you see a culture of shared accountability of WaterCare, which is a water utility company. And so what they did actually is that before tweaking their governance, before changing the checks and balances, before looking at, what does compliance smell like, they actually started to think about what do we want as an organization and how for us as an organization, we want people to behave and make sure that through their behavior, they will achieve the right outcomes. And as you can see, this was not a kind of exercise that was just done, with a kind of single product team or with a single agile team. This would literally encompass both the, corporate functions that you see there as finance and HR, but also the kind of, line of businesses and operations, procurement, and IT, to make sure that basically as a kind of, connected organization, everybody would embrace the same beliefs, right? And so one of the kind of things that the senior management team of the organization then carried out as a manifesto, walking the walk and talking the talk, so to speak, was making sure that the organization would believe in those kind of um, elements of what they put in the manifesto. So, for instance, agility over control really speaks to the adaptive governance model that you saw, right? Absolutely, you can have agility over control, but it doesn't say get away with control, right? We want to make sure that we can balance stability and agility at speed. Also, encouragement over condemnation, right? It's like, can we make a mistake? Absolutely, right? Mistakes happen. But what we do want to make sure of is that when the mistake has a potential to occur again, we are right at the spot to make sure that we have learned from that mistake and encourage people to actually learn from it and make a next corrective action next time. One of the other things also that you saw in a way of also why Joanne mentioned, moving away from rules, is that we want to be more outcome focused, right? We want to be more thinking about the things that we want from something rather than what the thing produces or what is the output of a certain thing. And even in the adaptive governance approach, what we basically have stated is that organizations want four things from governance, right? They want to be in control. They want to make sure they execute their strategy and achieve their mission objectives. They want to have agility. And in some cases, they even want to have autonomy of decision making. If you take an outcome based approach, you will have a much better way to translate back into who are the kind of stakeholders and who are the people I need to actually be engaging with, right? That's part of the strategic engagement narrative to make sure I get to that outcome. And so here, for instance, you see a way on how WaterCare has actually set this up top down and to culture as actually the lever to make sure that the organization could change. Another way to look at this is maybe at the much lower level in where you could say, well, listen, this is really where delivery takes place, but it also shows that it could happen into places where you actually think, this is really a kind of, high risk environment. And so what you see here on this screen is a way of how Standard Bank has looked at in ways of, how do we make sure that we can actually reward teams that really show promise, that really show that they have done the right thing, and that are consistently showing that they all the time can be trusted in with the autonomy that they have been given. So those teams that do really, really well and basically have earned all accolades, those teams are basically allowed to fly at the level of a private jet. We call them level 5 teams. And what it means in a day-to-day kind of approach is that these teams are allowed to deploy into production 5 times a day, as often as they want, right? So these teams were given absolute, basically, the keys to the data center to deploy whatever they wanted. Whereas the teams that were really low on that maturity level, that really had to still learn all the basics and become a good team that could be trusted in terms of releasing, software and configuration items to production, they were considered like low level number one, right? So they were at the level of a kite, because let's face it, when a kite falls down, it's less worrisome than when a private jet falls down, right? So, and this is the way that they looked at the way of how do we build trust into these teams? How do we reward these teams for the right outcomes that they go after? And so, what the Standard Bank at some point did is basically create a kind of journey for all these teams in which competencies, which skills, which behaviors, which kind of outcomes do these teams need to show for them to actually advance from going from a hot air balloon to a helicopter to a dinky plane. So these teams were not left to their own devices. They were held by corporate functions. They were held by, you know, um, people from the delivery teams, platform teams, to make sure that these teams at some end would come to a place where they could feel that as a team, they contribute towards the outcomes of the organization by delivering the things that the organization wants almost in an autonomous way, where you then see where the autonomous governance model came into play.
Hey,
And
Rennie, this is a
yes,
great example of what one of the questions in the coming in from the audience was what happens when an organization that goes to agile and DevOps and this product embraced environment preaches no more governance. Well, there's still decision making that is being made within these teams. The boundaries and the culture around that decision making is going to be based on the outcomes they're achieving, and more importantly, I think you said it quite nicely, how they're connected together and how some of those outside boundaries around corporate and compliance and so forth are still impacting it. So this is another great example of saying it's really not about removing governance. It might, you never remove decision making in a
absolutely.
company. No, no, I've yet to meet a company that has no decision making in it, regardless of what processes they're following. But it
Yep.
shows the readiness and it shows the cultural shift that impacts that, which says, hey, listen, I might be removing those old traditional control based governance, but I'm still doing decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the kind of great underlying mechanics that you see behind this picture is actually exposure of that decision, right? If you make a decision that has a high exposure to the organization because it can, take the organization out of business, it needs high levels of capabilities, high levels of competence, high levels of trust, right? That's when you get to the private jet. But if the exposure is still low, there's room to learn, right? And that's why you see the level one kite and the hot air balloon. So organizations are working with their teams together, and not everybody needs to be a private jet, right? And so they're working towards ways to understand, well, listen, where do we use these teams in the most optimal way? And where do we need the teams that need to be at the level of the private jet? And to your point, the exposure of decision making ultimately determines how high you can fly.
Yep.
And having said that, let me take you to a kind of, next approach here, which I think is something that we see happening as well, is that, of course, the decision making must be there, right? But decision making needs to lead to outcomes. And so one of the things now that organizations are predominantly looking at in terms of, if we give people decision rights, if we give them empowerments, if we give them the keys to the data center, so to speak, what do I get back for it in return, right? I'm giving people a lot of room to maneuver, but I do want to see, that we make some progress. And so one of the things that also has become a very interesting way at looking is to making sure that decision making is always directed towards a certain outcome that can be achieved, right? And the outcome is something that we would want rather than have an output, right? We would rather have outcomes than output. And so in the outcome direction, outcomes are linked to what the business wants, right? The outcomes are linked to the requirements that the business has. Outcomes are linked to value creation. And so sometimes people have to really think hard, right? Oh, I just made this decision around automating the DevOps tool chain. Well, oh yeah, the output is we can go much faster, but the outcome is that you accelerate the time to market. And this is the way that organizations need to rethink in the ways that they basically are looking at the decisions that they take for which type of outcome that they're doing it. And so, for instance, here you see the kind of way that Eastbank from Turkey has used the outcome orientation to actually make sure that the fusion teams that they have employed are always working towards something that the organization wants from them, right? So for Eastbank, for instance, the business value concept, right, was for them much more important than having, a list of long to-dos, the backlog, and what have you not in your kind of, agile approach. For them, the backlog was not the important thing, right? For them, the important thing is what is on top of the backlog. And that thing on top of the backlog better be something that is creating value for the bank, right? And so they were continuously calibrating their backlog to make sure that they were always prioritizing the things that creates value for the bank. Not meaning that, they will not do anything, that is break and fix, but what they could prioritize would always have, the kind of value creation elements on top. What is also a very important thing for Eastbank at that point is that it's as part of their strategy, their growth strategy, innovation took center stage, right? And so for them, innovation was a kind of much more equivalent of creating outcomes than rather looking at, how can we improve something existing and make it slightly better, and making also sure that people are empowered then to take an initiatives was also part of how the outcomes were created. So I would say the outcome focus is something that I would definitely, I think, with all the listeners and watchers today on the webinar, to make it as a centerpiece in terms of how you would want to reconfigure your governance in a just enough way. Because in the end, when you're going to propose your just enough governance approach, guess what? You will want to talk to your executives, right? Because they will be the kind of key stakeholders that will ask you, well, my dear CIO or my dear CTO, head of governance, what do you want me to understand from your concept of just enough governance? And it all boils down to what's in it for me, right? And the what's in it for me question, as old as it is, it still remains very relevant. And so what you need to think about is whenever you start doing a kind of just enough governance approach, that it fires on all cylinders of what the executive team wants from the organization, right? Maybe you are in the lucky, I would say, state that you have a very well-defined IT strategy. You have an excellent, OKR, ODM kind of, performance dashboard. Great. But in the end, if you're still challenged on what executives want from you, look at this slide, right? It's always around something in growth, revenue, value, impact. It's always something around let's make ourselves more efficient, more productivity with less investments, and making sure we're always risk adjusted. And by no means of coincidence, these are exactly also the same kind of topics that would come across in any type of governance meeting where you're thinking about, where should we invest in? And to Joanne's point earlier with the 4 questions, are we doing the right things? Are we doing the right things is often measured across these 3 elements. So also here again, the other recommendation would be is to make sure that whatever you propose as part of the just enough governance approach, and where you need to convince the executives on why this is the right approach, make sure it actually contributes to what the outcomes are of these executives. Which brings us to the kind of recommendations that we have. And I think to wrap it up in terms of what we spoke about today, and what also Joanne has mentioned as part of her conversation with you, is that we can actually break it down into kind of 5 key imperatives that you actually must look after in terms of having a just enough governance approach. So the first one, I think, from rules to principles, right? And I think Joanne explained the powerful principles can have in terms of making sure that when you're not in the room, people still can make the right decision if they apply the principles. What you saw from the Standard Bank examples, right? Competence breeds compliance, right? So if you want to have compliance, right, invest in competence to meet the regulatory demands. What we also have seen is that, one size fits all command and control governance is not going to cut it, right? You need to move and evolve your governance model to something more adaptive, where you can differentiate where the organization needs to be in control, where you can encourage the executive team to make the right decisions to execute the strategy, where you can empower agile teams to make sure they have the right empowerments to create value for customers and citizens, right? And then at the same time, also tweak your culture, right? Tweak your culture to make sure that you move to a model that says, you are accountable, to know we are accountable as an organization for the decisions that we take together. And as a way to also say, well, listen, in a way to restructure the organization. What we have seen is that actually the kind of traditional L5 to L6 deep hierarchical structures are also not anymore, I would say, flexible enough to meet the kind of ongoing demand of different ways of organizing how teams come together. So distributed structures, distributed teams, distributed kind of ways of fusion team, agile team, product team, all flavors that we see nowadays are really a kind of response to what used to be the old kind of very hierarchical structure. Which brings me then to the final recommendations I have for you today. Um, they are, I would say, start by understanding where your IT governance maturity is today. Like one of our key suggestions was, don't build just enough governance on a kind of broken governance model, right? That's basically combining injury and hurt together. Make sure you have a good foundation of governance before you move into something that is just enough. Um, Put culture at the center of your design, right? Because culture is going to be the kind of connective tissue that will make sure that at the team level, at the executive level, or at a kind of even individual level, you can rest upon that the right behaviors will make sure that the right decisions will be taken. And to my final point, make sure that your decision making always targets an outcome that your organization would wants to have, and you can support it by adopting principles that make sure that outcomes are always put at the center of something that the organization will do. Thank you so much. I will open the floor for any questions, and I'll give back to Kashif.
Yep. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Remy and Joanne, for sharing your insights. We have time to take some questions now. Please continue to submit your questions and thoughts in the Ask the Speaker box. And remember to rate this session using the link on the top left corner above the player. To submit your ratings, click Rate Session below the player. A box will open for you to select 1 to 5 hearts. Please note that 5 hearts is the top ratings. Share your feedback on the insights provided in the Leave Further feedback box and click Send. Before we get to Q&A, here are some resources to take you deeper into the topic. Access more research-backed insights to master your role and transform your business at a Gartner conference. Visit gartner.com/cal for a full list of 2023 Gartner conferences. Additionally, we invite you to download our latest journal, Gartner Business Quarterly Q1 2023, which provides insights into how leaders can enable their talent to keep transformation on track and achieve digital ambitions despite upheaval. Want to stay in the know? Connect with us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and sign up to our bi-weekly newsletter to receive the latest Gartner IT insights and updates across research, conferences, and more. It's all curated specifically for IT leaders and decision makers. If you want to learn more on how Gartner can help you achieve your mission critical priorities, contact us via the methods on this slide. You can download these resources from the bottom of the page. Plus, you can find more Gartner insights, access the presentation slides, and see upcoming and on-demand webinars at gartner.com/webinars. All right, Remy and Joanne, over to you to address the questions.
Well, there was an interesting question, Remy, that came up when we were talking through some of the cultural changes. And I actually want to approach it because there are a couple questions around the dependencies across the teams. And so if I think about my organization and how do I manage the dependencies across teams, and if I have one team that's very mature in their decision making and one that might be a private jet and one team that's a kite, and the private jet is dependent upon the kite. When I think about governance, well, the decision making in the private jet and the kite are decision making processes. But don't forget, folks, that the culture behind the changes here isn't just about an individual team's maturity in their governance. It's about governance maturity across whether it's IT, if we're looking at the entire IT operating model, or whether it's across IT and the business working together. Because decision making, there are impacts that occur within this decision making that you're leveraging. And if your team is very mature and they're dependent on a less mature team, then there's opportunities to mature some of those activities, whether it be through your processes, your approaches, or even your operating model that drives a lot of your culture. So yes, there are dependencies within the decision making, but I can't just focus on just enough governance within one aspect of my organization. As Remy mentioned, in some of the initiatives and some of the imperatives for just enough governance, we're going to have to look across the impacts and the connections because those outcomes are going to be driven by dependencies across teams, dependencies across the operating model. So that's something that you also need to take in consideration, and which is one of the reasons why when we started this, we talked about just enough governance is not a quick, simple solution in a bullet. It does require a lot of thought and connections being considered as you're moving towards this.
Absolutely. And I must say thank you all for submitting your questions. There's some great questions in, and probably we won't have time to answer them all. But I will take another question that came across, which was which functions to involve in governance. And this is a question that Joe and I get a lot, right? In terms of when we set up a integrated governance framework, which functions should we have in there? And I think one of the key elements when you think about governance is always think back that governance is always linked to a tangible or intangible asset of the enterprise, right? That's why IT governance is different from data governance, is different from, something around the governance of an intangible asset, right? Now, from the perspective of IT governance, right, which functions would you definitely see? Well, the functions that you would see in IT governance are almost joint at the hip on the scope and mandate of your governance, right? The scope and mandate is handed down by your corporate governance or by a oversight function, and that will stipulate what should be the scope of governance. The scope of governance often, and if you look at the kind of, ISACA COVID best practices, it would say, well, it's strategy, it's investments, it's risk management, it's resourcing, it's performance value. When you look at that scope, then you also get the kind of, peek behind the curtain. Which functions should you then involve into the governance process? Because these functions and their knowledge will be leveraged as governance mechanisms then to help the executive team make the right decisions. So the finance team might offer help in terms of, writing or explaining a business case in terms of, are the stated benefits in that business case realistic? The IT risk team might offer expertise to help the board decide if something is within compliance or within the risk appetite that we have. The financial planning or strategy team might help out in terms of, when we need to calibrate the strategy for the next coming year, what are the key initiatives that we need to prioritize? Having said that as well, you will find, of course, the IT function itself being one of the key stakeholders to help inform the board in terms of, what are the good decisions to make for the IT organization itself. Let me stress out once more again, the real problem with governance, though, for CIOs is that CIOs need good governance to govern IT. The tension comes from the fact that CIOs do not own the governance. And that's why we're sitting here today with lots of people in this webinar to help resolve this issue and to make sure that that a good governance capability works both for the executives but also for those in the technology leadership team.
So, and that might be hard for some organizations. There's a question here about, there might be a loss of control when we transition to just enough governance. And so how do we encourage our leaders to buy into this shift? Well, this all ties back into that culture and the trust that's created. There's a reason why control was put in place. We're trying to create order out of chaos, so we lock everything down. To shift out of that and to give up that control, well, the culture has to shift. There has to be a level of trust that's built within the decision making. Building that level of trust is going to come through the outcomes you drive, whether it's traditional back office IT operations and technology functions that are basically the core and running it. How do we build trust within that, all the way up to the net new imperatives that are going to give us new customer facing revenue streams with our external consumers and customers that we interact with? That level of trust has to be built within the organization and also drive out the control. Well, the best way to do that is exactly what Remy said. How do we align that decision making? How do we align the outcomes from the decisions we made to what the executives need and to what the enterprise is trying to accomplish, whether it's part of our business strategy or whether it's part of the mission or the vision that we have within the services we provide out to the citizen who might be our consumers. that level of losing control, the losing control mindset shifts in that culture as you begin to focus on those outcomes and build the trust within your ability to deliver those outcomes.
Great question. So as we are nearing the end, so I'll take another question, and I think it comes back to, I think, a kind of a good understanding. And the question was, does governance sit with IT? And so it's a very interesting question, and you could be mistaken, right? Because I mean, we see a lot of organizations that actually within IT, they have an IT governance department, and so for me, that's always a very interesting department to look at. But to put it officially, right? So what is the official answer? The official answer is no, right? I mean, no, because the thing is that IT governance sits in the IT governance framework, right? And the IT governance framework is the mandate for the executives to make decisions across the IT assets of the enterprise. And nowadays, I think if you look at Gartner's trend reports over the last 7, 8, 10 years, the IT spend out of IT is only increasing. So that already gives you the answer that the enterprise IT governance has a wider perspective than just the IT department. And it's ever so important when you think about the kind of governance approach here, is to think about if I look at the where governance has been decided, governance is the accountability of your executives and cannot be delegated anywhere else. So when decisions are going to be made at the different aggregations of your enterprise, right, at the enterprise level, at the department level, at the kind of functional level, at the kind of team level, product level, platform level, you always have to think about in which kind of implications does this have with the kind of executive and the enterprise governance framework, right? Because you could be making decisions at a lower management level that could have implications for something that was decided at a higher governance level. So, for instance, if you would say decide, well, listen, I think it's a small project, and we can implement this particular piece of technology, but it just skipped all the checks and balances because guess what? It was $100 project, so it just flew through, but the exposure of that project was that a critical system went down because it was an unchecked piece of software. Then you would have thought, should I have informed my governance board, because it was not the size of the investment, but it was the risk exposure of the investment, right? In the same way that organizations nowadays are thinking, well, chat GPT and all those AI technologies, it's all great, right, for the potential and opportunity that they can offer. But from a governance perspective, should we maybe take a different approach? And so where does governance sit? Governance sits in the IT governance framework as the accountability of your executives. Governance is not about managing the IT department.
Hey, Remy, we didn't get this question, but I want to ask it in the last minute or two that we have here. We spent a lot of time in this discussion today talking about just enough governance and how to get there. But when should I not do just enough governance in my organization?
Oh, wow. That's a good question because we spent the last 45 minutes on saying you should. But now, as a really anti-pattern question here, I think, like we said, right? I think if your governance today is very brittle, if you are, I would say, up to your shoulders into control-based governance alone, and there could be very good reasons why you are, right? You might be working in an industry that is predominantly heavily, control-based governance, think oil and gas or something around, pharmaceuticals. Um, be very, I would say, cautious with adopting some of the principles around just enough governance. It doesn't mean that some of the imperatives of the five that we showed you could still be very worthwhile to you, right? So the principles-based approach. Um, but my key recommendation here is that if today, and you feel as a professional that your governance today is really not up to scratch, I would not yet go to just enough governance, but first go to a maturity level that you feel is going to be the one that will offer you a good foundation in terms of from where to start, good IT governance and build from there. And for those who are asking with Remy, what is a good maturity level then, right? On a scale of 1 to 5, a good maturity level with anything that goes closely towards 4. So
So
thank you so much. Kashif,
thank
back
you
to you.
again, Remy, and thank you for taking the hard question at the end. I appreciate that. Kashif, I think we're back to you. Thank you, everyone.
Of course. Um, so Just a minute. Thank you, Remy and Joanne. Audience, before you all go, just a quick reminder: you can download the presentation slides and other helpful resources from the bottom of the page. Please rate this session and share your feedback on the insights provided. To submit your ratings, click Rate Session below the player. A box will open for you to select 1 to 5 hearts. Please note that 5 hearts is the top ratings. Share your feedback on the insights provided in the leave further feedback box and click Send. All right, with that, I'd like to thank again our presenters and, of course, to the audience. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great day. Goodbye.